Hello and welcome back to another update. In this one, I'll be covering the developments throughout the second day of the Israeli-Palestinian war, where we have seen a lot of territorial changes, a lot of combat footage, and so much more of escalation and continuation of this war. So let's get straight into it with the territorial changes. So what has changed throughout the second day is there has been some Israeli advances throughout the front line, and there's been some Palestinian attacks in the direction of the suburb of Tel Aviv of Holon. So in this area, there's been some video footage, which is shown here on the screen right now, of some Palestinians fighting in the direction of Tel Aviv of Holon. So we see that there has been some of these soldiers who have gone from Gaza and all the way up to Tel Aviv through these breakouts from the fences throughout the borders between Gaza and Israel. As for the counterattacks the Israeli forces launched throughout the day today, we have seen that they've managed to recapture a lot of areas here to the north of the Gaza border, where we see that they managed to capture all of the areas except for the military base, which is still under Palestinian hands after they managed to capture it yesterday. So the equipment that the Palestinians managed to capture here has been transferred back into Gaza as the Palestinians try to adapt to them and learn how to use them in a very quick manner so that they're able to use them in this conflict. We've also seen that the Israeli forces have managed to essentially encircle the Palestinian forces within Ashkelon. However, according to the latest information, the Palestinian fighters who are still here within the city are still fighting against the Israeli forces within the city. So there's a lot of clashes within the city of Ashkelon here to the north of Gaza, and the Palestinian forces are trying to re-establish a connection between the two areas, either to withdraw the forces in Ashkelon or to establish a connection to send reinforcements to the area. Whichever the case, the Israeli forces are trying to hold this location to cut them off so that they can get rid of the Palestinian forces within the city of Ashkelon by encircling them and cutting off their supplies. However, what we're seeing is a very different kind of warfare than that of Russia and Ukraine, which I'm usually covering, because what we're seeing is that there's a major difference between the two sides. This is not a war where there's an army fighting an army. This is a war where there's a fully fledged army, that is the Israeli army, fully equipped with tanks, fighter jets, and so on, fighting against the Palestinian forces, who are essentially infantry with small arms, and they have some drones and so on, but it's mostly just infantry with small arms. Also, the fighting is within civilian populated areas. These civilian populated areas mostly consist of, well, cities where there's a lot of civilians. So the fighting is actually happening with Palestinian infantry infiltrating these cities filled with civilians, and the Israeli forces have to fight through the streets filled with civilians to fight the Palestinian forces. This is, of course, not a straight-up confrontational face-to-face kind of fighting. It is instead fighting where there's a lot of civilian danger. There's a lot of danger for the civilians. However, there is no other option for a war in this scenario, because it's either that or the fighting in Gaza, and Gaza is such a small area, as is seen right here, and it has a population of 2 million. So the population density, comparing this to the area of southern Israel, which in total consists of about 1 million, so half the population of Gaza, yet about an estimate would be 10 times smaller. So the population density is much smaller in the Israeli areas compared to Gaza. So the Palestinians are here, either they're going to fight amongst their own population, their own civilians, or if fighting amidst the Israeli civilians, and then they are taking these Israeli civilians as hostages, bringing them back to Gaza to try to prevent the Israelis from bombarding Gaza as they're holding them hostages as civilians. With that, the Israelis will have to think twice before bombarding Gaza. However, what we're seeing from video evidence is that despite the hostages, the Israelis are heavily bombarding Gaza throughout the second day of the conflict. But moving back to territorial changes, there's been a lot of fighting between the two sides. And of this, we have multiple videos, of which there's this video here of a Palestinian fighter firing an RPG at an Israeli tank. And we have another video here of a Palestinian drone dropping a innovative explosive device, an IED, on a Israeli tank. And this is similar to the first day where we also saw one of such videos. We also have a lot of bombardment between the two sides and a lot of small arms fire. I'm not going to show the small arms fire because that's not allowed on YouTube, based on my experience covering the Russian-Ukrainian war. But we also see these airstrikes by the Israeli planes flying overhead as the Palestinian forces try to drive through the roads in between the Gaza area and the Israeli territories. So we're seeing that the air force of the Israelis are giving them a huge advantage as they can fly overhead the Palestinian forces, but the Palestinian forces hardly have anything to fight against. We do have some videos of Palestinian forces shooting the Israeli helicopters with some Igla stingers and so on, trying to shoot down these helicopters, of which they've actually managed to, according to open source intelligence, shoot down 4 Israeli helicopters. But from the start of the conflict, I sat and reported on in my previous 2 videos that the Israeli response was extremely slow compared to what was expected in case such a thing happened, like this Palestinian incursion into Israeli territories. So what we see is that the Israelis essentially didn't launch any airstrikes before the night of the first day. However, on this second day, we have seen a lot of airstrikes across the Gaza territories. They first announced that they were going to bombard specific areas where they suspected Hamas territories and areas to be, after which after 4 hours, they started bombarding them, of which we see multiple pieces of footage we see airstrikes, and we also see that on the West Bank, which is this much larger area. However, although I've made the map like this is not what is under Palestinian control, because the Israelis essentially control all of the West Bank, where they have their own security forces and so on within the territory. So although I've mapped it out like this, because it is politically supposed to be like this, as we can see the border drawn on Google Maps, the Israelis actually have full control over the West Bank, essentially. So with this information, we see that there is massive riots on the West Bank. There's not armed assaults like in Gaza, because in Gaza, the difference is that there's no Israeli presence within the city. But on the West Bank, there's heavy Israeli presence. So they do not have the ability to build up a military similar to Gaza. But essentially what we're seeing is that there's heavy clashes and massive riots throughout East Jerusalem and the West Bank of the Dead Sea. So what is the next step after this happening that has happened throughout the day? We have seen that the Israelis have retaken most of the territories that the Palestinians have managed to capture after the first day. On the second day, it was definitely the day of Israeli counterattacks, although there's still heavy fighting within the areas which prior to this offensive was under Israeli hands. The Israelis are making a massive buildup, not just at the Gaza area, but also at the northern border, because according to an Israeli journalist, and their sources are the US officials, they estimate that the Israeli Defense Forces ground operation in the Gaza Strip will begin in the next 24 to 48 hours. So the Israelis are planning on a ground operation in Gaza to try and essentially take over Gaza and, well, essentially do the same as they have done in the West Bank territory, which is to remove any possibility of a military existing within the area, so a full annexation of Gaza. And this is a very, very risky and controversial play, as it includes and going through and ignoring warnings by both Egypt and Hezbollah and Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So there's a lot of countries that will be significantly pissed off by that take. And despite not warning directly, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey will most likely also be majorly pissed off, including all of the Gulf countries, as well as generally the whole Muslim world. And all of this is most likely only being done because we have seen the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talk with Biden twice over the past 24 hours. This indicates that everything they do is in close coordination with the United States, who has announced that they will send an aircraft carrier to support the Israelis. How that will work is up to time to tell, but it is definitely an escalation. So with a continuous Israeli buildup and the risk of a Israeli ground operation throughout Gaza and huge tensions building in the area due to such a decision, we'll most likely see the situation escalate beyond what we're currently seeing, and the war will drag on for yet another days, maybe even further. If this ground operation takes place, the Israelis will have to go through a city with 2 million population. They are calling on the civilians to evacuate, but so far we're seeing that most likely there will still be a lot of civilians. And throughout Gaza, it has essentially been fortified by the Hamas forces for about 50 years, ever since Hamas came into power. They've always planned on using Gaza as a defensive city in case of an operation by the Israeli forces. The reason for this is based on other wars throughout history. Cities can work as a natural fortress because of the density of these cities, not just the population, but the fact that there's so many buildings, apartment buildings, and so on, to be able to have natural covers in and build fortifications within, which allows them to essentially fight for every single block. And if we fight for every single block, then it will definitely take a very long time, because as we can see, these are major cities as they house 2 million people, and it's just one straight line. There's always the possibility that the Israelis will just plan on completely flattening the cities instead of actually going through them, but so far it seems that they are building up for a ground operation, and they're already bombarding the city completely to dust, as we've seen with the videos of that so far. So essentially there's a huge escalation coming, but how much and how the different countries will respond will change the outcome of this conflict, and especially what will actually happen, because so far it seems that the Israelis are committed to getting rid of Gaza altogether. Not really Gaza specifically, but more Hamas, which essentially is in control of Gaza, and as such getting rid of Gaza. But that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.